Discover the shocking problems at this Southern California Marine Corps base. You look at a map, find Camp Horno squeezed against the coastline, and think, Southern California, sunshine, training ranges. That's the daytime version. At night, when the maritime layer settles in and the world softens to grey, that little cluster of ranges and shipping containers becomes a different place entirely. Fog rolls like a tide, sound gets eaten, paths steepen into blind choices, and everything you think you know about where you're safe becomes negotiable. Marines who work there don't talk about ghosts as a genre. They talk about hazards, both the kind you can fix and the kind you can't easily name. Those reports taken together point to some genuinely shocking problems: environmental traps, procedural blind spots, equipment failures, and a social culture that quietly punishes anyone who says they saw something strange. If you want more investigations like this, stories that mix the eerie with the practical, stick around and subscribe. I'm going to walk you through what Marines have reported at Camp Horno and why those stories matter beyond the chills they give you. Camp Horno isn't a single building or barracks tucked into a base. It's an arrangement of terrain features that, once you know them, explain a lot. Imagine steep hills that drop off into gullies, an exposed ridge called the Alpha Shelf that gets hammered by the marine layer at night, and mock urban areas, mout towns assembled from shipping containers, lined up like abandoned storefronts. Add barracks with long second-floor catwalks, narrow ECPs, entry control points, where board guards watch the same stretch of road for hours, and trails that look harmless in daylight but turn into maze walls after dark. The fog is the base's most theatrical character. It comes fast and thick, swallowing shapes and turning headlights into diffuse halos. It eats radio ranges in odd ways. Sometimes there's perfect comms, sometimes a buzz of static that blanks out the frequencies you expect to use. Night optics help, but they introduce their own problems. Depth flattens, distant stars become smeared streaks, reflections turn deer eyes into strange pinholes of light. Throw in human factors, 4 a.m., watches, broken sleep, boredom, and the environment collaborates with biology to make perception slippery. For civilians, a PMAG is a polymer magazine for the M4EAR platform. NODs are night observation devices, night vision goggles or monoculars, used for patrols. ECP is an entry control point, basically a gate where guards check traffic. A mout town is a mock urban layout used for close-quarter training. Those terms will come up because these incidents happen during routine duties. A single Marine going back for a dropped PMAG, a pair on fire watch inside a mout town, a night rounds patrol in the barracks. The routine is part of the problem. One Marine remembered sliding down a steep berm, teeth clattering cold, and losing a 40-round PMAG against a rock outcropping. It wasn't just the mag. Most Marines treat a mag like a personal talisman. People fuss over their kit. He could have reported it the next day, but he went back alone at night to retrieve it. That decision, go back solo in the dark, is a small human error that cascades in environments like Horno. The ridgeline where he was searching had deer signs, loose scree, and a way of making you feel watched even when you weren't. He'd gone off the defined path. Halfway through the search, the fog thickened and the world flattened. Shapes lost contour and depth perception tricked his feet. He described deer at his periphery, heads punctuated by reflective dots, and then something else, a dark, human-shaped silhouette standing maybe 30 meters away, with 2 points of light where eyes should be, blue and very bright against the fog. He said the lights felt wrong, too steady, almost like LEDs in a mask rather than animal eyes. He remembered an acidic taste in his mouth and a spine-deep stillness that wasn't quite silence. There was the muffled sound of his own breathing and distant surf, and then the blue points moved. He didn't run at first, he froze and then backed a step, losing balance on the loose gravel. When he sprinted, he couldn't find the exact place again. Fog had rearranged the landscape. He came back with the PMAG in hand, but he said the mag didn't feel like a victory. He felt unnerved, a kind of sorrowed anger, maybe at his own decision to go back alone, maybe at the idea that something had watched him and not shown itself in daylight. Operationally, this story highlights predictable but dangerous things. Solo retrievals of gear in poor visibility, loose terrain that causes falls, and how night optics and fog can combine to create convincing false positives. Night vision devices amplify IR and visible light unevenly. Bright reflections and thermal contrasts can make wildlife or wet rocks look like human silhouettes. In other words, it's plausible that deer, reflective scree, or a combination of headlight glare and condensed fog could create the impression of blue eyes in the dark. But plausibility doesn't erase consequence. A Marine going back alone for a magazine is one decision away from a broken ankle, a fall down a gully, or worse. The fix isn't about proving whether the figure was a person or an apparition. It's about policies that discourage solo retrievals, ensure someone is posted to watch, and make reporting small losses standard instead of embarrassing. If that felt unnerving, wait until you imagine a mock urban area, the Mout towns at 0200. Shipping containers stacked like shuttered shops, alleyways that swallow light, and a breeze that plays tricks on sound. 2 Marines and a corporal were on firewatch inside one of those Mout towns. Firewatch doesn't mean firefighting. It means watching for anything that could ignite. Cigarette butts, equipment overheating, or the kind of scattershot hazards a pile of empty tack cases and trash presents at night. Their shift was supposed to be dull. Boredom is a risk factor because it encourages improvisation or inattention. Around 0200 they heard something in the brush, a soft rock thrown against metal somewhere downwind. Then, faint and unmistakable, a child's giggle, not the high laugh of a new boot laughing with friends, but a one-syllable, breathy sound that landed like a stone in the middle of their shift. One of the Marines reached for the radio. In the headset they heard nothing but a low, grainy static for a few seconds, then silence. They called their supervisor and got told to stand fast and report in the morning. The watch continued. Steps brushed the gravel behind the containers. A corporal went to check the perimeter and found nothing, but the movement didn't stop until the relief squad came on at 0400. With more bodies, the place felt safer, and oddly, the sound stopped. The relief reported no footprints leading into the brush, and nothing showed on their thermal viewer, apart from small, warm disturbances that could have been rodents. This incident raises technical and cultural flags. Auditory pareidolia, where the brain organizes ambiguous noise into recognizable patterns like speech or laughter, can occur in high-stress or low-sensory input environments. Radiostatic can mask or mimic sounds, and the mind fills in patterns that sometimes become convincing. But the operational problem is clear. A distracted or unsettled firewatch is less likely to catch real hazards. Command's quick dismissal, stand fast, report later, is a cultural choice that discourages immediate escalation. If a Marine thinks they're going to be laughed at for a report, they are more likely to downplay real safety concerns. Whether the giggling came from a wandering civilian child, a wildlife echo, or a genuine unexplained source, the near-term consequence is the same. Attention is diverted, and risk creeps back in. The barracks round story is the kind that makes haunted house tourists salivate, but it's also a textbook case of how living spaces become operationally compromised by the weird. A Marine on duty doing rounds noticed a figure in the parking lot, a woman, he estimated Asian, standing at the edge of a row of cars. He was halfway through his checklists, doors locked, lights off, windows secured. He called out, and the figure turned and walked up toward the second-floor catwalk. When he moved to intercept, he said he could hear soft footsteps overhead, the particular hollow thud of boots on metal. He went around the building and saw a shadow at the far end of the catwalk, like someone leaning against a railing, hair moving in the fog wind. When he reached the stairwell and called up, the sound of the footsteps continued for a few seconds, and then stopped abruptly. No one came down, no one answered. He checked security footage later and reported that the cameras showed nothing but a blip of extra light that didn't look like a person. 2 Marines on duty together made an informal pact. They wouldn't tell the platoon sergeant because they didn't want to get labeled. Both admitted later they felt a little off for the next few days, the kind of hyper-awareness that drains morale. Why does that matter beyond a spooky story? Living quarters are where Marines rest and reset. If people feel unsafe, or if uncertainty infiltrates sleeping spaces, the downstream effects show up in training performance and situational awareness. A base that treats odd reports as embarrassment rather than potential security lapses risks both morale and real vulnerabilities. Again, there are plausible explanations. Someone could have been a transient civilian who got onto base, camera glitches happen, and fog-induced visual distortions can create phantom figures. But the operational response was the real issue. Silence as policy or as consequence erodes trust and makes it harder to surface actual safety problems. On a late pre-dawn drive, another Marine reported seeing two figures on a back road wearing old green fatigues that didn't reflect light the way modern textures do. He said they looked like a photograph from decades ago, fabric draping and cuts that didn't match current uniforms. When he blinked, the figures didn't cast reflections from his headlights. They appeared and then melted into the fog, as if the road had an older memory waiting beneath its asphalt. He pulled over, told himself he'd been tired, and kept driving. He didn't file anything because who reports time slip aloud? Yet the core operational layer is the same. A driver seeing unfamiliar figures in reduced visibility risks sudden braking, swerving, and collisions. Night driving under fog on narrow roads is already an environmental hazard. Add a startling visual, and you have a recipe for an accident. Technically, modern fabric sometimes behaves differently under certain light spectrums, and fog combined with angle of light can make materials appear less reflective. There are also documented cases where headlights bloom in moisture-laden air, washing out some details while accentuating others. Exhaustion and low sleep drive can make brains misinterpret visual stimuli. So, a plausible chain exists from fatigue to misperception to near miss. But the practical takeaway is simple. If enough drivers report unexplained figures at certain places, those locations should be logged, analyzed, and mitigated with signage, better lighting, temporary speed restrictions, or changed routes for early morning movement. Treating the sighting as a curiosity and letting practice remain unchanged is a problem. Then there's the one Marine who, with a half smile and a regretful laugh, confessed to wrecking a blank adapter. ECP duty is boring. Long stretches of time with nothing happening are the exact circumstances that encourage fiddling. He had access to a blank adapter, the device that allows a weapon to cycle blanks used on ranges for simunition or ceremonies, and he decided to see what would happen if he topped a 5.56 blank with powder typically used in 7.62 blanks. It was an improvisation born of boredom, poor judgment, and a cultural inclination toward tinkering. When he fired, the adapter shredded from back pressure, the bolt didn't cycle right, the rifle spit metal, and he walked away with ringing in his ears that never fully left. He told the story with a rueful tone that disguised serious consequences: partial equipment failure, a risk of injury had the weapon been held differently, and a lingering tinnitus that affects sleep and focus. This is the sort of safety failure that isn't exotic. It's low-skill misuse of equipment under low supervision conditions. The improvisation could have been prevented with a stricter control of training devices, clearer policies about who can tinker, and better boredom mitigation during low-activity watches. Getting laughed at or prosecuted is not the same as providing clear, enforced standards, and an environment where reporting a close call is normal instead of shameful. What ties these stories together? The mag in the fog, the giggling in the mout town, the woman on the catwalk, the figures in old greens, the blank adapter explosion, is a pattern of human factors colliding with the environment and equipment. Fog and terrain create optical and auditory illusions that are real enough to distort behavior. Fatigue and boredom make people take unnecessary risks or misinterpret sensory cues. Radios and night optics, while essential, have failure modes that can amplify rather than resolve uncertainty. And culturally, a quiet pressure to avoid looking foolish or to accept weirdness as part of the job suppresses reporting of near misses and small safety infractions. Listening to these accounts, you can sketch both cautious explanations and unsettling possibilities. The blue-eyed silhouette could be a deer fixed in a reflective frame of different lighting, a prankster with battery lights, or an artifact of night optics. The giggling in the mout town could be animal sounds shaped into human laughter by a tired brain, or interference on radio frequencies producing phantom audio. The parking lot apparition might be an actual civilian who wandered in and slipped off base unnoticed, a camera glitch, or a sensory illusion amplified by a mind already keyed to threat. The time slip claim may be misread fabric under headlights, or it may be a coincidence of light and fatigue. The adapter mishap is purely mundane, improper loading, wrong tools, and a human decision that had entirely foreseeable mechanical consequences. But here's the point. Whether these incidents are explainable or not, they expose systemic weaknesses that deserve attention. The most mundane explanation, that night visual artifacts mislead people, isn't comforting. If multiple Marines independently report similar anomalies, blue eyes past uniform figures, unexplained audio, there's a higher chance that those perceptions will lead to risky behavior. The base might not be haunted, but it could be dangerous in ways that the paperwork doesn't capture. Standard operating procedures assume rational actors in expected conditions. When conditions skew perception, all bets are off. Every one of these stories also carries a social cost. A Marine who reports something odd and is laughed at becomes less likely to report the next time something important happens. That silence can be lethal. Unreported OH&S hazards don't get fixed, and boredom-driven improvisation continues. The psychological weight of "I can't tell anyone" chips at unit cohesion and creates a background low-grade anxiety that shows up in mistakes on the range and frayed tempers at long-range patrols. You can draw some immediate practical fixes from these accounts. Enforce no solo retrieval policies for dropped kit in low-visibility conditions. Log and map sighting reports, not to compile a ghost dossier, but to identify environmental hotspots where fog and terrain repeatedly create perceptual problems. Adjust firewatch procedures to avoid long stretches of single-person dull duty in areas with known auditory oddities. Rotate personnel more often, or assign two-person checks. Conduct an audit of training gear like blank adapters, and ensure that only trained armorers handle modifications or fueling. And make it clear that reporting something that unsettles you is not shameworthy. It's part of keeping everyone alive. At the same time, the reports deserve sober inquiry. Night optics and radio equipment should be checked for failure signatures. Security cameras in key locations should be validated for fog conditions. Some models completely lose contrast in heavy moisture. Base leadership doesn't need to declare an explanation for every sighting. They do need to treat reports as data points that inform safety planning. I say all of this because the stories, stripped of melodrama, point to a single hard truth. Weird or not, perceived threats change behavior. Whether the figure in the fog was an animal, a pranked Marine, a visual illusion, or something else entirely, it caused a Marine to leave his patrol plan, go someplace less safe, and come back shaken. Whether the giggling in the mout town belonged to a kid, an echo, or the wind in the containers, it made a fire watch less effective. Whether the woman on the catwalk was a civilian misadventure, a camera artifact, or a hallucination, the outcome was people changing how they move and sleep on base. So far we've been watching the environment do what it does, but I'm going to stop for a second and underline the cultural element. A lot of Marines won't file formal reports for these incidents. Why? Because the reaction they expect includes laughter, skepticism, and sometimes a formal write-up that brings awkward questions rather than solutions. When that pattern repeats, entire categories of risk, perceptual hazards, boredom-induced tinkering, early morning driving scares, stay invisible to safety officers. That invisibility is a problem as real as a fractured ankle. One evening, sitting with a small group of veterans who had shifts at Horno, I heard another detail that tied a few of these threads together. Several people independently mentioned radio static, synchronizing with the moment something odd happened. It wasn't a pop or a dropout, one said. It was like the static would swell, and in that swell the other noise, footsteps, a laugh, was clearer. That pattern suggests at least two things. First, radio noise can act like a mask and a spotlight, masking some frequencies while amplifying others, creating chances for pareidolia. Second, the fact that multiple people reported the radio oddity at different times means it should be measured and not dismissed as purely subjective. Here's where the practical and the eerie meet. If you can identify a frequency interference that spikes under certain atmospheric conditions, you can mitigate it. If the interference is a hardware issue on a specific set of radios, you can retire that stock. If it's environmental, perhaps set procedures to change watch patterns during expected marine layer events. The point isn't to discount personal experiences, but to turn experiences into data for improving safety. We haven't even touched in full on how equipment failures compound these problems. The blank adapter incident isn't a curiosity, it's a symptom. Devices that allow for safe simulation must have safeguards against being used outside their design parameters. Bored Marines should not be able to transform training tools into hazards with a half-hour's experiment. That one carelessly run experiment left a man with tinnitus and a weapon that needed replacing. That outcome is preventable with better control and oversight. At the moment those stories start to stack, narrative coherence emerges. Fog and terrain produce ambiguous stimuli. Fatigue and boredom bias interpretations. Radio and optics have failure modes that can intensify the uncertainty, and cultural silence turns every oddity into an unaddressed hazard. Those are the shocking problems hiding beneath tales of blue eyes and time slips. But before I move on to more of the accounts, some that cross into truly uncanny territory, there's a question that's worth asking out loud. What happens when leadership treats reports as either luck or lunacy? The answer is a slow erosion of safety practice. If a Marine thinks saying, "I heard a kid's laugh and then the radio cut out," will mean he'll be mocked in the chow hall, he won't say anything. If an armorist hears of an improvised experiment that wrecked equipment, and the immediate response is punishment without analysis, others who might tinker will just hide it. The fix is not punishment or conspiracy denials. The fix is creating a predictable, non-shaming incident reporting culture that does two things: removes stigma and provides rapid corrective action. Now there's a story I saved for the end of this segment, because it sits at the intersection of the uncanny and immediate physical danger. A Marine on a cold pre-dawn convoy reported seeing soldiers in old green fatigues standing by the road. He said the uniforms didn't catch his headlights the way new gear does. No reflective Velcro, no modern sheen, just a matte darkness that seemed to belong to another era. He kept his foot on the accelerator and told himself to ignore it, and in doing so avoided pulling over into a ditch. He didn't file anything. His reticence is telling. More than the fear of the sight, he feared the reaction he'd get from peers. I could spend the next hour parsing optical physics, fabric reflectivity, and human perceptual error. I could say, convincingly, that the combination of fog, angle of light, and fatigue likely produced a misreading. But that analysis, however careful, is not the end of the story. The operative problem remains unchanged. A driver startled at 5:30 on a narrow road is a safety hazard for himself and others. This is where I'm going to pause. The next set of accounts digs deeper into patterns of radio interference, repeated reports of similar visual characteristics, bluish eye points, figures wearing non-reflective fabrics, and a disturbing thread of underreporting that seems systemic. We also need to trace the technical evidence. Are there known radio frequency anomalies in the Horno corridors? Do the security cameras show consistent blind spots in fog? Who tracks lost or damaged blank adapters? And has the baseline been established to notice a trend? Those are the questions that turn spooky stories into safety audits, and that's the difference that matters. The fog may be able to hide shapes, but it shouldn't be allowed to hide preventable risks. We'll get into the detailed pattern analysis and the concrete fixes next. Because once you catalog locations, times, and equipment involved, the mystery begins to lose its magic and becomes something you can actually do something about. Those are the questions that turn spooky stories into safety audits. So I started asking the follow-ups no one likes to ask in the chow hall. When exactly did it happen? What were the weather conditions? Which radios were in use? Did anyone log it? And who checked the footage? What began as a few anecdotes quickly looked less like isolated chills and more like a set of repeatable triggers, certain pockets of terrain, a predictable marine layer, and the same handful of equipment and behavioral patterns showing up again and again. Multiple Marines independently described the radio behaving oddly at the moment something strange happened. That's worth pausing on. Radios don't laugh or mock, they carry signals and interference. If static or a swell of noise consistently precedes or accompanies a report, that's a measurable thing, not a ghost story. It could be dying batteries, antenna mismatch, crossband interference, or a particular frequency hitting an atmospheric ducting condition in the marine layer. It could also be as simple as a headset loose at a connector, making a sputter that, to a tired listener, sounds like something else. The point is this: a pattern involving comms is fixable if you treat it as data. Start with the simplest step: log it. Every time someone reports a strange sighting or sound, record the basics: time, location, weather, devices in use, witness state, hours awake, and any equipment serials. Don't frame it as a ghost log. Call it a perceptual hazard report if that helps. When you have a dozen entries, you can map clusters and overlay them with weather and training schedules. If most incidents cluster on the alpha shelf between 0200 and 0500 on foggy mornings, that's not a spook story anymore. That's a hazard map. Those hazard maps suggest tactical countermeasures. The alpha shelf and certain gullies already demand respect in daylight. In fog, they demand rules. Enforce a no-solo retrieval policy for lost kit after dusk. If a PMAG goes missing, the default is not go back alone. It's record the location, mark it, and get a buddy or a watch posted. A simple checklist: lost item logged, two-person retrieval, comms check, would prevent a lot of those nervous, high-risk decisions. Use the same mapped data to identify early morning driving routes where reduced visibility plus startling visuals are likely. Alter convoy times or routes, post temporary speed limits, or add reflective markers that behave predictably under fog so drivers have consistent cues. Firewatch rotations deserve attention. One-person static watches in containerized mount towns are a perfect breeding ground for pareidolia, the brain filling in sensory blanks, and for boredom-driven mistakes. Two-man teams, shorter rotations, and small, low-effort tasks will keep attention engaged. If staffing is too thin for that, change where people are stood. Move them from a single fixed post to a roving two-person patrol. The goal isn't to eliminate the eerie, it's to remove the context that turns an odd noise into a dangerous distraction. Cameras and optics are another technical block of fixes. Several witnesses who later checked footage said the cameras showed only a washed-out glow where they remembered a person. Not all camera models perform the same in heavy moisture. Some lose contrast completely. Others bloom in a way that makes small thermal spikes invisible. Audit the security kit. Run fog condition tests. Compare visible light cameras to thermal imagers, and assess whether IR illuminators are properly aimed and shielded from backscatter. A thermal camera won't care what color uniform someone is wearing. It will show a human heat signature even through fog, within limits. Cameras can be supplemented with passive acoustic monitors that log spikes in specific frequency bands. If footsteps or laughter coincide with a spike on an acoustic recorder, you have objective evidence to analyze. Whether it proves an apparition is another matter, but it does help determine whether something physical passed through. The radio issue needs equipment-level troubleshooting. If a particular set of radios shows repeated static during the marine layer, retire them for testing. Use a spectrum analyzer on-site during different atmospheric conditions to see if interference is local, bad wiring, generator harmonics, base-wide, ground loops or shared infrastructure, or environmental, ducting, reflections. If the noise is occurring only at certain locations, map it to light poles, generators, or other emitters. The fix might be a new antenna, a different channel plan, or an SOP to swap to a secondary comms method during predicted marine layer events. Night optics also deserve a closer look. Nods and PVS equipment amplify infrared and ambient light unevenly. Wet surfaces, fog droplets, and shiny polymer on a PMAG can produce blooms that read as eyes or human shapes. Training should include sessions on how NVGs render common objects differently in fog, and crews should get briefed on specific false positive signatures, what a deer looks like in a PVS at different ranges, what wet rocks do to depth cues, and how thermal couplings can make non-living objects appear warm. That's not about taking away the tools, it's about training the eye to recognize the tool's limits. Then there's the human problem, the one that's not solved with a thermal camera or a new radio antenna. Culture. The anecdotes make clear that many Marines choose silence because of embarrassment or fear of ridicule. Silence is itself a hazard because it prevents pattern recognition. Fixing culture doesn't have to be high drama. Small administrative changes can make a big difference. Introduce anonymous near-miss submissions with quick-turn feedback. Make a point to treat every oddity as a safety-informing piece of data. Thank you for reporting, here's what we checked. Rewarding reports with a small near-miss commendation, paperwork that recognizes sound judgment rather than ridicules the perceptual oddity, can shift behavior. Build after-action reviews that explicitly include perceptual events as an expected data stream to analyze, not as something to be laughed at. Boredom-driven improvisation is a separate but related cultural failure. The blank adapter story isn't an edge case. When people have stretches of low stimulation and a ball of curiosity plus access to gear, they tinker. The result was a shredded adapter and a man with tinnitus. A lifelong invisible injury. Chain of custody for training devices needs tightening. Blank adapters and similar items should be controlled like any other training ordnance. Checkout logs, authorization lists, and required supervision for any maintenance or experimentation. Designate a single armorer or small team as the only authorized hands for fuels and blanks. Couple that with boredom mitigation plans, scheduled maintenance tasks, light physical training, or assigned observational duties that make idle tinkering less tempting. Medical response and reporting also need attention. The Marine with ringing in his ears left with a condition that affects sleep, concentration, and long-term health. Hearing tests should be available and routine after any weapon malfunction or near miss. Normalize seeking medical attention for sensory changes. Include a brief hearing screen protocol in post-incident checks so tinnitus doesn't get normalized as part of the job. Some of the explanations for the more uncanny reports remain plausible and scientific. Optical reflection, pareidolia, radio interference, camera limitations. Others remain open. I'm careful with the language there because the last thing we want is to dismiss people out of hand. One consistent thread is this: when you combine low light conditions, fog, fatigue, and a social cost to reporting, the environment tends to manufacture mystery. Confronting that manufacture with concrete changes will reduce both the number of reports and their operational consequences. But this is also a story about how small design choices make big differences. A single reflective strip on a wayward trail marker, placed at knee height so it gives a driver a predictable cue when the fog rolls in, will reduce sudden swerves. A repeater or relay at the Mouttown Ridge can eliminate the momentary static swell that primes a listener for phantom voices. A policy that requires two-person retrievals after dark will keep people from taking needless risks for kit you can replace. None of these is expensive compared to the cost of an ankle broken in a gully or a rifle injury from an improvised blank load. There's a tactical humility required here. You don't spend manpower on every ghost story. You don't lock down training areas because someone reported a figure. What you do is look for objective correlates. Are reports concentrated at certain points and times? Do they align with specific hardware models, radio bands, or environmental conditions? If yes, you design light, cheap mitigations that remove the operational hazard without pretending to answer every metaphysical question. I want to make one more technical point because it explains a lot of the repeatability in these accounts. Atmospheric ducting, fog scatter, and backscatter from headlights. In the marine layer, droplets are suspended in such a way that they refract and scatter light differently than in dry air. Headlights can bloom, thermal signatures can smear, and sound can refract in unexpected ways. Those physical properties can be modeled and predicted. That means you can create a forecasted reduced perception period during which certain activities are restricted or augmented. You don't need a mystic to tell you that a 0300 fog bank is a different operational environment. You just need policy that treats it as such. I also want to be blunt about leadership optics. If leadership's immediate response to a perceptual incident is to joke about ghosts in front of the unit, that undermines any attempt to build a safe reporting culture. This is not a call for fear-based leadership, quite the opposite. Leadership can be lightly skeptical while being supportive. We'll document it, check the cameras, and let you know what we find. That sentence costs nothing and signals that reporting is a professional act, not a reason for ridicule. Now, beyond structure and equipment, there's an emotional seam here. Marines described the after effect differently than the initial shock. For some, it was the adrenaline rush of being startled. For others, it was the slow burn of unease that lingered for days. That lingering matters. If you start measuring training mishaps and find a small increment in mistakes after a reported perceptual event, that's a signal. People don't bounce back instantly from things that make them doubt their senses. Include psychological aftercare in your response. Simple checks, a quick debrief, and the option to swap a Marine off a high-attention task for a short period without stigma. There's also a practical data angle that's easy to implement. Cross-reference incident logs with weather station data, security camera logs, and maintenance records. If noise spikes correlate with generator activities or a particular transmission frequency, you find it. If camera blind spots line up with a certain model or placement, you fix it. If most incidents happen within 2 hours of a shift change when people are low on sleep, you adjust scheduling. Those are real, measurable levers. Let's return to the human stories for a moment, because they ground the recommendations. The Marine who went back for a PMAG didn't go because he liked risk. He went because kit is pride and a little ritual. A PMAG is a small object that means readiness to him. The Marines in the moat town were trying to keep the base safe by watching for fire. The apparition in the barracks was a Marine trying to do rounds. The driver who saw period fatigues kept moving because he didn't want to stop in a place that could swallow him. These are not theatrics. They're ordinary people making ordinary decisions in abnormal sensory environments. That's why the fixes are ordinary too. Buddy systems, better logging, hardware audits, modest lighting, checks for boredom, and non-shaming reporting. You might be wondering whether any of the more unusual reports, blue points of light, figures in old greens, ever had corroboration. There were a handful of cases where more than one person experienced something similar within the same night, and a smaller set where relief teams arrived and reported the sensation of something off without seeing anything distinct. That doesn't prove anything supernatural, but it does reinforce that the perception is sometimes shared. Shared perception increases likelihood of behavioral change, and thus increases risk. Treating those shared reports as data points, not jokes, is the only responsible leadership posture. So, what would a minimal action plan look like for a place like Camp Horno? First, immediate administrative steps. Institute a simple perceptual hazard log and require that all odd sightings be entered within 24 hours with weather and device notes. Map the entries weekly. Enforce a no-solo retrieval policy for lost gear after dusk. Require 2-person fire watches in container mount areas for at least the next 3 winter months while you test mitigations. Second, technical audits. Evaluate security cameras' performance in fog, compare visible light footage with thermal imagery, and deploy acoustic recorders for periods with high incident counts. Run a comms audit, check antennas, run a spectrum analyzer, and identify radios that show anomalous static in humidity. Test NVGs and provide specific training on how objects render in fog. Third, equipment controls. Require signed checkouts for blank adapters and similar simulation devices. Restrict fuel handling and blank loading to trained armorers. Run a quick inventory sweep to identify any devices that have been modified or used without authorization. Fourth, culture and training. Implement a non-shaming near-miss reporting program. Include perceptual hazard recognition in night ops briefings, and rotate personnel more frequently during long, dull watches. Add a brief psychological aftercare step to the post-incident checklist. 2 minutes to ask how someone is feeling and whether they need a break. Fifth, monitoring and feedback. Present outcomes back to the unit. If a report leads to a camera fix, tell the Marines. If a radio swap stops the static, tell the unit. Closing the loop is the cultural lever that turns reporting into a habit instead of a risk. None of this eliminates the strange. It reduces the number of times strange turns into danger. That trade-off is exactly what we'd want from a safety program. Fewer injuries, better morale, and an environment where weirdness is recorded and learned from, not hidden. Before I close, one small point about the blank adapter confession. The Marine who told me about blowing an adapter laughed through most of it, but when he talked about the ringing in his ears, the laugh left his voice. Tinnitus isn't glamorous, It's a reminder that some consequences are permanent, even when the underlying cause was a moment of boredom. Treat that story as you would any medical close call, because that's what it was. So where does that leave us with the title question? Discovering the shocking problems at this Southern California base. The real shocks are less about specters and more about the fragile seams that turn ordinary training into risky business. Fog that rearranges space, radios that hiccup at the wrong time, people who are tired enough to misread a deer as a man, and a culture that sometimes makes it safer to keep quiet than to report. Those things add up faster than any one unexplained light. If you work on a base like this, or if you care about the people who do, there are small steps that make a measurable difference. Log the odd stuff, adjust SOPs to prevent solo retrievals, audit comms and cameras for fog performance, control sensitive gear, and make reporting free of shame. If leadership treats reports like data and not entertainment, the unit will get safer and the stories will lose their teeth. I'm not asking anyone to decide what the blue eyes were. I'm asking leaders and Marines to decide whether they'll keep tolerating the conditions that make such reports dangerous. That's the practical choice. Reduce the opportunities for error, make reporting routine, and fix the gear that fails at the margins. If you've experienced something similar at Camp Horno or elsewhere, share it below. Dates, locations, and device types help when people are trying to make sense of a pattern, and consider passing any safety concerns up your chain or to base safety so they can be logged. These accounts aren't entertainment for me, they're signals. Treat them as such. Keep looking out for one another and keep the radios on good channels.